Indeed, our heritage is rich. It is good to say we have a rich heritage. We have a rich heritage because Trinidad is by far and away the most cosmopolitan of all the islands of the Caribbean. Virtually from everywhere in the world, people came. And in coming, they brought their cultural heritage with them. They brought their religions, they brought their festivals, they brought their cycles of folklore, they brought ideas that conveyed a sense of meaning. And this is what has stayed with us as a wonderful residue that we draw from. And this is the Trinidadianness that we know and we like and we enjoy so much. And in a sense, this is the mass that we play when we play mass at Carnival. This is what we draw from when we tell our children Jumbie stories. This is what we draw from when we lime and enjoy life and tell tall tales and spin out the sort of telling that we do. And it comes from this heritage. And essentially it is drawn from the oral heritage. It comes from the art of storytelling. Because you have to bear in mind that before the days of television and radio, when the sun went down and the home sweet home lamps were lit, throwing big shadows against the wall, and the children sort of gathered around, probably some old guy or some grandmother in the lingering twilight, what they heard was stories. What they heard was tales of long ago. What they heard was sometimes stuff that was virtually made up on the hop. So the oral heritage and the oral tradition in Trinidad is a very strong one. It expresses itself apart from storytelling, it expresses itself, for example, in carnival characters like the robber, great heritage character, express themselves, for example, in the pure grenade of long ago, where you would come up and you would ask this pure grenade, who was a man who was a learned man, and he would pose you an elaborate question and you had to answer him in rhyme and that sort of thing. The oral heritage expresses itself in extempore, in calypso, because as most of us who were born during this last World War would remember, you should be able to sing a calypso on any subject, just so. You should be able to do that if you're a born Trinidadian. So the storytelling heritage and the heritage, the oral heritage is part and parcel of the collective genius of what we know as Trinidadianism. A part of that, of course, is, and a great part of that, is the storytelling. An essential part of the storytelling has to do with the mythology, the mythographia that we invented. And the myth is a way to explain the unexplainable. It is a way to come to terms with ideas that appear to be supernatural. It is a way to come to terms with natural phenomena. And it is also a way to teach people how to live life in a certain kind of a way that is in harmony with nature. So you take, for example, Papa Bois stories. Papa Bois is the old man of the forest. He's the old man of the forest. He's an old guy, but he's strong still. He have one foot like a cow. He have hair growing all over him. Some people say he have like a twig growing out with leaves. But basically what he is, in fact, is that he's the guardian of the animals. He's the guardian of the birds. He could change himself into different things, He, for example, I heard a story the other day. Papa Bois one time changed himself into a big tree and fall asleep. So he slept for about 200 years. A frog practicing jumping, coming down the road, jump straight into Papa Bois' ears and fall in a big pond. You understand? And that is what woke him up. So he kicked out the frog and he continued on his way. Because what he was really doing was going to punish some hunters who was catching bushfires. You follow? So this is the stories of Papa Bois. Papa Bois liked the rain, right?
Let's pause for a minute.
Turned into a tree and fell asleep.
Yeah, that was the last part. Ready?
And what woke him up was this frog. The frog was coming along, you know, practicing hopping. And he hopped straight into his Papa Bois ear, where they had a big pool that had formed. And that what woke him up. And then he remembered what he was going to do. He was going to stop forest fires. Because they had some fellas up the hill starting fires and things, and he was going up there to wring their neck. And Papa Bois is that kind of character. Papa Bois is said to be the one who protects the animals. Some hunters are very bad shots. So you fire a bounce behind a deer, lick off piece of his ears, shoot him in his foot or something like that. He hop into the forest, he gone up further and further and further, he meet Papa Bois fix him up and thing and bring him back alive and so. But Papa Bois is a vengeful fella too, eh? Because he would come and look for you. And he will find the camp where you're camping. And you come and tutu in your pot. Or on the other hand, he might encourage you to follow him because you think from the trail that he's leaving behind that he's some animal. And you will follow him, go up in the bush, go up in the bush. Next thing you know, you lose. So Papa Bois is the savior of the animals. He's the savior of the environment. He's the savior of the trees. He's really the father of the forest. But he's also a vengeful father. So you have to be a little careful with him sometimes because the depredations that you commit, you will pay for it in some kind of way. The other folklore characters now tend to be a little more terrifying. And I think that by far and away the most terrifying of all of them is the Sukuya. The Sukuya stories come from different parts of Trinidad with a certain sort of intensity. Like you take, for example, in Paramin. Paramin have Sukuya stories. I went to Paramin some years ago researching folklore. And I was with a Tadi, the Paramin people. And he told me, he said, you see that old house up there? He said, that was Sukuya living there, you know. So I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you want to go and meet her? I said, no. The Sukuya stories come out of a time when it was a clash of cultures in a sense. Because the African people who came to Trinidad brought with them a type of shape changer, a woman who could become a ball of fire, a woman who could become a strange creature. The Europeans brought with them the idea of the vampire. And it is out of those two, and it was old Father de Vertai who did a bit of research on that, and he wrote it into one of his books. It's very interesting. And he was the one who pointed out that the Sukuya stories come about as a result of a joining together, a syncretic movement out of these two types of witch stories. And the Sukuya has the capacity to take off her skin. Now people always say, but how she could do that? Well, the answer is very simple. What she have to do is she have to have an old black penny from 1837. And she have to go to a cemetery on a moonless night, find a freshly dug grave, dig out the grave, open the coffin, and scrape out the liver from the corpse. And out of that, you make an oil. And it is from that liver oil that you rub down that you are able to come out of your skin and turn into a ball of fire. So she would come out of the skin, she'd take off the skin like a wet jersey, and she'd put it in a mortar like that, and she would flap in the air, and all the dogs in the village, and with that she gone, flying through the night. Now she's looking for somebody to drain out all the blood out of them, you know. 4 in the morning now, she heading back home, back inside. When she reach inside, she have a little song she's singing. She come inside, and she begin to sing, skin, 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 come to me, skin, 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 come to me. And you see the skin now would get up in the mortar, and it come across, and she fit up in the skin. Right? Now you know how you catch a sukuya? You have to mark the little old house where she live in. And as you see she fly off, you have to go in the house. And you have to go in the house with a handful of coarse salt and throw it in the skin. And when you throw it in the skin is go like that. And when she come back, she can't keep on the skin because of the salt. And the daylight rising in the meantime, so that's how she get whole. Long ago they used to burn them in a big drum of tar. Sukuya. They have a lot of sukuya stories in Parliament. They have sukuya stories in Miaro too. The last sukuya story I heard in Miaro was an old lady named Mrs. Gould. Mrs. Gould was an old sukuya. She was a real old sukuya. She didn't used to trouble nobody in the village. She really used to go down Guaya. Anyway, she used to keep her skin, especially as her mind was going and things, she used to keep her skin in a mortar on top of the water tank.
Stop it, sir. Yeah, hold on.
So she used to keep her skin in a mortar. Sometimes she used to forget where she put the mortar with the skin because her mind wasn't so good. One day she flying home. It occurred to her that she put the mortar on the water tank in the police station. So she land on the police station looking for this mortar with the skin, right? Daylight come and catch her. Everybody see this old woman naked as she born on top of the water tank in the police station looking for his skin, right? I told that story on the radio one day. I didn't say her real name, and within 5 minutes, I get a phone call in the radio station. They say, you have the wrong name. So the Sukuya stories is a real thing. And I always remember it is said that one Sukuya is make another Sukuya. And I was never able to discover how they do that. That's a Sukuya secret. The other interesting character, of course, is the La Diablesse. Now, the La Diablesse now is the devil woman. The La Diablesse is said to be the vengeance of the woman who has been wronged by mankind. That is the revenge that women take over bad men. That at some point in time, the La Diablesse come for them. You see, men who beat women, men who treat women badly, starve them, deprive them, put them out, all kind of thing. At some point in time, the La Diablesse will come for them. And the La Diablesse will come for them in a strange way. Because the La Diablesse is a surprising creature, you know. There used to be a La Jablesse on the old Southern Main Road. A friend of mine knew about this La Jablesse, right? And he was no goody-goody. So he had to be very careful. One night he going south. So he driving down the old Southern Main Road. He see the La Jablesse. He say, mash the X. Pass she, boom, like that. When he do so, he look in the rearview mirror, she in the back seat. The La Jablesse could be a horrific experience, but the La Jablesse could also be a beautiful woman. Depends on how she want to take you. The La Jablesse could appear in the middle of the day. La Jablesse don't have to be a night creature. Could have a gang of men working in a field, and suddenly a tall, nice-looking woman appear. And she walk through the field. She don't look at any one of them. She just walk passing. One man look up, see her, put on the tools. He begin to follow. She walk a little faster. He behind her. She speed up. He speed up. She go in. He run in. She gone up the hill. He fly and he run in. She almost as though she not touching the ground. They reach quite up the hill. When they reach up the hill, he lose. She gone. He bazodi. He lose. Next day he come down. He's stupid. He can't focus. He has no shadow. But he don't even notice that. You know, there's other people say, boy, look, boy, he has no shadow. And he remained total bay for the rest of his life. La Jablesse. The La Jablesse typically appears in the costume of long ago, like a Martican. She have her hair tied in a madras. She wears a nice crocheted top, big skirts with plenty embroidery and so. And the first thing that you hear is boop, and that is her cloven hoof. Then you will hear the sound of a chain rustling in her petticoat, and that is the memory of slavery. What she have is a bag, and in the bag is her bones and the dirt from her grave, because she dead. She has died because of somebody who will treat her and make her die. But she is the revenge that come to take care of some man as a result of what he has done. So in a capsule, you better be careful what you do, Anthony.
Rolling.
The Dwen stories are, again, for some people, some storytellers, one could almost pinpoint the time when the Dwen stories begin to make the rounds. And the Dwen stories come about at an interesting time. There were two things happening in Trinidad at this point. In the 1850s, there were two things taking place. One thing that was taking place was a terrible cholera epidemic. It swept Port of Spain to the extent where there was something like about 30 or 50 or so people dying every day for 60 days or 70 days at a time. Now, Port of Spain was a small town, with 15,000 people or something like that. So that kind of loss was a terrible loss. Most of the people who were dying were children. The cholera epidemics that swept through the Caribbean in those years was terrifying. It came about as a result of water wells. Water wells dug in backyards, near to cesspits. People had no idea that what was in the cesspit would inevitably get into the water well, especially at rainy season. Cholera was the result. The other thing that took place around that time was this was a period when Great Britain ran a blockade against Portuguese slave ships out of Africa bound for Brazil. Britain was trying to bust the Portuguese economy for some reason or whatever the historical machinations were. The people who were taken off those slavers were brought to Trinidad and given their freedom. These were people from the West African coast, and they were known as freed Africans. Many of them were Yoruba-speaking people from that part of West Africa that is known today as Nigeria. These people, many of them settled in East Port of Spain, Belmont Valley Road, various places. These people brought with them a body of folklore stories. They brought with them a fresh impetus of West African religions. Among the stories that were brought were the idea of the spirits of children, the spirits of recently dead children. I personally don't know the ramifications of it, but the people who brought those stories came to Trinidad at a time when there was a great quantity of kids who were dying of cholera. And out of this came the idea of the child who dies before it is baptized. Now this is obviously an interpolation brought about by Christianity, who dies before it is baptized, whose spirit remains to be a mischievous, haunting spirit that would lure other children into sometimes terrible accidents, or lure other children into situations that would scare the living daylights out of their parents. So sometimes when you go and you delve into these stories, people tell you these things. Now there's no way of knowing if this is actually true, but it is interesting in the telling, because this might be, you see, all these stories come from the joining of different cultures. It is where cultures meet, is where heritage abut, and out of it come stories. So the idea of the dwen, the idea of the little creature who only have a mouth, he have no eye, no nose, he have a little old hat, his feet turned backwards. So people say, why his feet are turned backwards? Well, that is symbolic of coming from the other place. Because if you were to go to Brazil, for example, the dancers who come out to dance in the hotel and so, they come out dancing backwards, because they give you the impression that they come from the other world. So here's the dwen with his feet turned backwards, the little creature, little pot belly, little foot turned backwards, no eyes, only a little mouth, little creature, who haunts the edge of the forest, who lives on the riverbanks, who live just at the edge of the village, and who has a special kind of terror, a special kind of panic that is generated mostly in the minds of parents. Because 6 o'clock reach, you're looking for your child. You walk outside, you call. You go in the road, you look, you call, and you ain't seen the child. The first thing, your heart begins to jump. You walk up the road, you ain't see the child. Everybody's house closed up already. People lighting their lamp, you're putting out dinner. Night coming, you can't find your child. You reach in the village, you see a ravine. You're looking down in the ravine, you think the child in the ravine. There's all that is the panic of the thing, They have a lot of different dwen stories. I'll give you a dwen story. A boy died, and his good friend went to his funeral. He couldn't stand the sound of the dirt dropping on the coffin in the grave in La Perouse Cemetery. So he turned around and he walked out of Laperouse. He crossed Stragglereef Road, walked up Stanmore Avenue, gone by the Savannah. He figured he would be just in time to catch the 6 o'clock tram in front of Marley Street by All Saints Church, because he lived in Belmont. As he reached the Savannah, he see the tram pass, so he knew he missed the tram. So he decided, well, all right, he walking through the Savannah. So by that time now, nightfall. One big moon coming up over Laventry Hill. He walking through the Savannah, but he's not frightened or anything because he from Belmont and this is Savannah and you know where he going, right? So he decided that, boy, you really miss his friend, you know, but they had a whistle. They used to whistle Monkey Eric. So as he walking through the Savannah, he whistled. And then he whistled. And he whistled loud. So loud he get an echo. He make him jump. And he get a kind of fright. And he decide, look, let me move a little faster. And he never noticed the little creature that appeared. Just above the ground, floating behind him, following him home. He raised the Dwen. Well, after that, he was compelled to whistle, their whistle. And every time he whistled, the Dwen would come. But he never saw it. It was his grandmother who began to realize that they had a Dwen that was following the boy. And she was the one who knew what prayers to say to send back the Dwen. And it turned out that this boy who had died was a big boy. He was 12 or 13 years old. But he had come from down the Main. And he was never baptized. So he died from some childhood ailment or something like that without being baptized. So he was a Dwen. The Dwen stories are panic stories. And mostly they affect not so much the children, but they affect the parents. The little boy sitting in the yard, swinging on the gate, would hear somebody saying, Johnny. The sound was coming from over there. So he go to look. By the time he reached there, he hear it over there. By the time he hear it again, it's over there. By that time, nightfall. He spend the night in a tree. Send his poor mother crazy looking for him because she ain't studying that he in no tree. When? Mama Glue. Mama Glue, or Liu, means mother of the water because Liu is water. You will find the Mama Glue character in most of the islands in the Caribbean. You will find her expressed in various ways. It is interesting to note that islands in the Caribbean could be described as Catholic islands and Protestant islands. In Protestant islands, she becomes a mermaid character. In the Catholic islands, she becomes a Mama Glue character. Why? Well, you'll have to ask the anthropologists. In Tobago, Mama Glue, for example, is a mermaid. Interestingly, in Tobago, a mermaid is a man. I once asked an old Tobagonian, so what a mermaid look like? Boy, he looked over his shoulder, he didn't want anybody to hear. He said, they look like warriors of long ago, or kings of old. I said, mermaid? He said, yeah, mermaid. I said, well, what does it do? He said, they take you. Take you where? He said, take you below. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, whereas before you was mediocre, now you're brilliant. Whereas before you was poor, now you're rich. but they have a price. The price is the death of someone close to you by drowning. So I say, oh, that's terrible. He said, but they have a way out, you know. I say, well, what is the way? He said, well, I will tell you. You must go to the beach, full moon, and you must carry with you 2 pairs of ladies' shoes, and you must burn them on the beach. And you must turn your back on the waves and walk away and say, nothing but this pair of shoes. And the mermaid would rise out of the water, but you must not look back. And that is how you will be able to break the contract. So I say, right. Now, Tobago also have now something they call fairy maids. Now, fairy maids, different business. Fairy maids now don't live in the sea. Fairy maids now live below the bridges. They live where they have a big water wheel. And the fairy maids now could fall in love with a nice man. Fairy maids like men with smooth skin, youthful appearance, and they will take them and have their way with them. And sometimes they will give them a prize, depending on how things turn out. Or on the other hand, sometimes they could make them stupid and make them get dotish and go off. And if that happened now, the only way you could break that spell is you have to beat that person with a fowl. Why a fowl? I don't know. But Mama Glue now is Trinidad stories. Mama Glue is the spirit that lives in the rivers, especially on the northern range. This is where I heard Mama Glue stories. The first time I heard a Mama Glue story, it was from an old lady by the name of Miss Dolly. Miss Dolly said to me, she was living in Tacarib. She said to me, straight out of the blue, she said, you know, they have a Mama Glue living in Shark River, Mr. Besson. So I said, that's what Miss Dolly. She said, yes. I said, you ever see her? She said, yes, I see her. When I was small, we were washing clothes, and I see her, she turned in the water. I said, how she looked? She said, she was pretty just like me. So I said, is that so? It was an interesting story that she continued later on that evening. She said that when she was a girl, she used to go into the forest. She used to follow Shark River, up Shark River until she would come to a nice pond in the forest, deep pond. And she would go there and she would take her clothes to wash, she would spend the day, she would take a little sandwich to eat and all of that sort of stuff. But most of all, she used to like a part of the pond where the sunlight came down into it, and she was able to see a reflection of herself in the pond. And she used to look into the pond until one day she see the pond looking back at her. At first it made her jump, but then she realized it's okay. It's a beautiful woman who there. So she used to go back and she got to know this figure, this face that appeared in the pond. One day she went, she carried with her all she had. She carried her a little dolly head. She carried with her some little clips to put in your hair and thing. She carried with her some buckles from her shoe. She carried with her all the little things that she had, little girl things, right? And she put it on a stone because she carried for this lady. The next day, when she went back again, she see a comb made from a shell, and it have a part in it like gold. It was so beautiful. It was fantastic. Then she take it. Afterwards, she used to go, she used to sit down where the water fell from a height, in the sunlight, beating on a rock, the sun making the spray around her turn like a rainbow. And she used to comb her hair. One day she see a man come in the forest. When he do so, he see her. She watch him. She say she see the man, he get pale. He run back in the village. He tell everybody he see Mama Glow. But he ain't see Mama Glow, he saw her. He come back again. And he realized that she's a girl. He come back again, she talked to him. He come back again, he told them sit down. He come back again, they talk. The next day she went back. The face tell her, no, don't get involved with that. But she fell in love, so she went. The comb lost its effervescence. Long ago, she used to be able to put it to her ears, and she used to hear like a symphony. She used to hear beautiful music. It stopped playing. It used to be always shiny like it wet. It became brown, dull. But many, many years later, as an old woman, as a really old woman, she on a boat in a pirogue. They're coming into Yarra. They're coming into Yarra and they pick up a squall. And as they turn the boat to come into Yarra, the waves was high. She says she feel her heart in her mouth. Because the way the boat was going, and the Spanish boy who was running the engine, like he didn't know what he was doing, and she felt the boat would have capsized. She said she reached down in the bag and she find the old shell. And she hold up the shell. And she tell the waves to go down. And she remind the waves that she used to be a friend of the face, the water. And she said to me, she said, you know, Mr. Besson, the sea got calm, and we beached the boat. That's a story.
And the last one is the Lagahoo.
Last one is the Lagahoo. Now the Lagahoo is the Lagahoo is the ultimate Obia man. He is the shape changer. He's the science man. He's the one who's read books on the Tital Bay, and he's the one who know all the different names to summon up all the different demons and the archangels and thing. He's the one, if your wife giving you trouble and she have an ex-man, you go and see him and he could go into a trance and he could tell you, yes, I seen her now. She getting on board a taxi at the corner of Green Corner and they go in San Fernando, she and this man. You have to pay me $20 and I would make the tire go down. Because you know, he's a businessman. So although he might be a magician and he could see this and see that, you have to bear in mind he's a businessman, right? So he's the science man of the village. He is the fellow who could change himself into a different creature. He could change himself into a big hog. He could change himself into a dog. He could change himself into a cow. He could change himself into different kind of things. For different sort of reasons. Mostly, he changes his appearance so that he could dominate and frighten people in a village. Because at the end of the day, people come into him to get different kind of recipes. For like getting bald, he getting old, he's not what he used to be. He come to the old man say, well, you have to do so, you have to take this kind of bath. You have to do various things so that you could catch yourself. But you have to pay me so and so and so. So that is the kind of thing. You put a spell on somebody. He's a man who will put your enemy name on a piece of paper, put it in a crapo mouth, sew it up with black thread, right? And you put it in the person's house, or he put it in the person's house. So when that person wake up in the morning, you see this big crapo jumping out all over the place with the mouth sew up, with the piece of paper sticking out. You pull out the piece of paper and have your name on it, right? But most of all, the Lagahu has the capacity to do some pretty amazing things in this sense. And this is a story about a Lagahu. There was an old police partner of mine who told me this. He said, boy, he said, you seen Maruga? They had a Lagahu. The Lagahu used to come out as a phantom in the night. And what I saw was like a big creature, 30, 40 feet high, with two legs like that, so on either side of the crossroads. Massive creature, wavering in the wind. This creature with long hands, long legs. Then the next thing, you hear chains dragging in the road. And when you do so, you see a black man rubbed down with grease, naked, and on his head he have a coffin with 3 candles. And he dragging the chains and he walking up the road through the village. He said when that going on, everybody out there light. Everybody gone lie down flat in the drawing room, gone below the bed, children hiding, people begin to say their prayers. This man passing, dragging this thing. He said one night he and a couple of police partners decided, right, we go hold he. And one thing lead to the next, and they hold the guy, and waiting he had in the coffin, bush rum. That's the business of the Lagahu. He was making babash, right? Hear how he did it. He had a projector. In those days, you call it a magic lantern. In the evening around this time, so he started a little fire with some green bush, so plenty smoke. But it's night, so the smoke up in the sky, you know, you're not really noticing a lot of smoke. Then he project onto this column of smoke a figure with long legs and long arms. So you know, you living in the village, you have no TV, nothing. You seeing this thing wavering in the night. It look like a phantom. Right? The next thing you know, you're hearing chain dragging. You're seeing this naked man with a coffin on his head coming up the road. Well, nobody ain't gonna stop him. Waiting to have the coffin, babash. Because the Lagahu have a still, right? And he making bush rum. So it is not always what it appears.
Right. Let's get a closing comment now about
Folklore on the whole. Folklore on the whole, as you have heard it here this evening, you could consider it to be like the antibodies in a national culture. It is the retention of this folklore. It is a retention of this body of stories told in this manner that acts as a sort of antibody against the influences that come to us all the time through television and foreign television, that in a sense seeks to make us not what we really are. So it is out of the retention of folklore, out of the keeping of the folk traditions of the people. And listen to what it is, eh? It is folk, it is lore. It is not L-A-W, it's L-O-R-E. It is folk wisdom. It is the wisdom of the people. And that is what makes for the uniqueness in a culture, in a people. And that is why we must keep it.
Great, wonderful. All right, we're going to continue on now.
You have what? You have about
17 minutes. So
17
that's enough
minutes,
to
yeah,
talk
but
about.
that is good.
Let's talk a bit about, well, the changing face of the capital. I mean, a rich history, great architecture, changing.
Port of Spain is, as Caribbean towns go, Port of Spain is not a remarkably old town. Um, Port of Spain is a mere 200 years or less. Um, Port of Spain is not like Scarborough, Tobago, that is really a much older town. Or like Bridgetown, Barbados, that is a much, much older town. Or Kingston, Jamaica, that is an even older town. You're talking 300 years, or nearly 400 years. Port of Spain was literally what the name implies. It was a little port in the Gulf of Paria, off the Gulf of Paria, that belonged to Spain. The capital of Trinidad was San Jose de Oruna, St. Joseph as we know it today. Port of Spain, 250, 275 years ago, was a mangrove swamp, no different from Caroni Bird Sanctuary, because it was the same mangrove that went all the way up to the foreshore and by the Jean Pierre Stadium and all of that. It was the same mangrove. So Port of Spain was really a little clearing in that mangrove, if you could imagine Caroni Swamp, right? It was just a little clearing in the swamp where the land was more or less dry and where the Spaniards had put up um, a little thatch house and where they had built a kind of fortification made with fascines. Fascines are baskets plaited together and filled with stone, fascines. And that was Fort San Andres that we know today, that is down by the lighthouse. So down by the lighthouse and Broadway that we know today, that piece of Independence Square going east to Besson Street, right, was Port of Spain, because that was Port of Spain. Everything was there. I mean, everything was there. The Spaniards did not build in stone in Trinidad. Everything was built in adobe, in tapia, in thatch. So with perhaps one or two exceptions, with the exception perhaps of Fort San Andres, and that is a dubious exception, there's nothing in Port of Spain itself that has survived from Spanish times. Because the walls that you see around Fort San Andres are relatively new, you know, they were built over and so. There's a Spanish remnant, however, in East Port of Spain, on the brow of Laventille Hill, not too far away from the church. And that is something that is called Fort Chacon. And that is where the police today have a transmitter. They have a lot of radio transmitting material up there and so. But it's not a fort. It was never a fort. It was in fact an observatory. And if you know East Port of Spain, you will know that there's a street called Observatory Street, which once led to the observatory. And the reason why that is there is because in 1792, the first meridian established in the Western Hemisphere as a result of the observation of the stars was done on the brow of Laventille Hill. The 63rd meridian of longitude was the first meridian in the Western Hemisphere that was established by a man called Don Damian Churuca. He was a vice admiral in the Spanish Navy, and he was the astronomer royal of Spain. And he came here in Chacon's times, the last Spanish governor's times, and he established the first meridian in the Western Hemisphere, the 63rd, on the brow of Laventille Hill. And one is not even too sure if that pile of stone today is really the observatory, or if that pile of stone might have come 100 years later or 50 years later. But the spot is there. Port of Spain comes into existence as a rather muddy, somewhat sprawling little wooden town after the cedula of population of 1783, which brought French people here by the dozens. The French people came here to a Spanish island because of a legal document called the cedula. It was the French people who first brought African slavery to Trinidad, because in those days, Trinidad had no industry, Trinidad had no agriculture to speak about.
Okay, let's roll again. Trinidad.
Trinidad had no industry, Trinidad had no agriculture to speak of before 1783. It was the French people who came from the different islands. Some of them were white people, some of them like Europeans. Some of them were mixed colored people who were free. Both the colored people, French colored people, and the French white people, all considered Creoles, brought slaves to Trinidad. People are often surprised to know that free blacks and people of color would own slaves. But that is how it was in those days. And it was these people who came to Trinidad, and it was these people who began to build Port of Spain. They built it out of wood. They built it out of wood by basically cutting down the very old forest, the original first forest, all around Port of Spain. Forests of cedar, cyp, hardwood forest, mahogany, pui, and this was the original little old town. Now that old town burnt more or less flat in 1803. It was after 1803 that it was decided that firewalls had to be built between buildings. And if you go around Port of Spain today and you see parking lots, empty lots, you will see these rather high grey, limestone grey from Laventille quarries, stone walls. And these are the firewalls that were built to prevent fires from jumping from one building to the next. Because the phenomena of fire in the Caribbean, people forget it today, but fire was a very powerful element around which people lived all the time, and later on I will tell you how it affected people in festivals in Port of Spain, like for example, Canboulay. So Port of Spain was originally built out of wood, that burnt, and then Port of Spain became a little stone city, built of stone. And if you notice something and you go about, you will see, especially in East Port of Spain, you will see very, very tall doorways. And you will see there's an art of putting stones on the edge of the doorways that is called coining with a Q. That is very French. You will find that style in a lot of French towns, a lot of French cities, and you will find it in the French islands of the Caribbean. The idea of the little dormer windows in the roof, giving light and air to an attic. The idea of the slate roofs, or sometimes the roofs are made out of clay, little round shapes. If you drive down Piccadilly Street on the left-hand side, just before you come to Laventille, the foot of Laventille Hill, you will see one or two little houses there, and they still have that kind of roof structure. Is worth taking a shot at. And the town was a little town that was very similar to Fort de France or Port-au-Prince or any of the little towns in the French West Indies. Very similar to what you would see in certain parts of St. Lucia, for example, or Dominica, for example. Below was a place of business, upstairs it was where the family lived. In the back of it would be a place where, during the period of slavery, there would be a barracks where the slaves would live. After the period of slavery, this is where servants would live. Or this is what would become storage rooms. And there would be stables, and there would be inevitably a big gateway. And if you go around in Port of Spain, you will still see a few big gateways with a large arch, and you could see where a carriage could go through. So Port of Spain had about it that kind of little Frenchified, little provincial town look. Wrought iron galleries, overlooking pavements to bring the shade. The period would have been one where at this time of evening you would hear people playing the piano. If you were to walk along the street, you would hear perhaps somebody singing their scales. You would hear somebody playing violins, making all your hair stand on end. And because there would be, in those days, the idea of retaining European culture, the idea of home entertainment, the idea of if you had a family with a lot of girls, well, you would want to teach them how to dance, you would want to teach them how to play musical instruments. So there was this kind of gentility that people have in their minds still, to some extent, although they themselves didn't experience it, or perhaps not even their parents experienced it. But this is the nice old days of long ago that people have a kind of memory of. Now, there were a lot of beautiful buildings, official buildings that were put up in Port of Spain. You could call it official architecture. You take, for example, the police barracks down in St. James. The police barracks, built in about 1819 or 1820 or somewhere around there, are the oldest public buildings in continuous use in Trinidad. What is interesting about them is that they are the only examples of Georgian architecture in Trinidad today. Georgian architecture, you probably see more of it in Barbados, and you'll see more of it in other islands and so. The two main cathedrals, both built by the same man, a fellow called Reinangle. The Catholic cathedral was built in a Romanesque style. The Anglican cathedral was built in a Gothic style. And in a sense, they both represent the people who lived here. On the one hand, there were people who were Protestants and who hankered after a British tradition. And then on the other, there were the Catholics and those who hankered after that. Spain, by the 1850s and 60s, had acquired a very pleasant prospect, in the sense that there were beautiful parks in the city that had been laid out, old pastures, like for example, one that was known as Shine's pasture that became Victoria Square, had been made into a very pleasant environment. Lord Harris Square had been laid out. The Memorial Park was still part of the Savannah, but the Savannah was a lovely stretch of land that went to the foothills of St. Anne's. So Port of Spain had about it that kind of spacious gracefulness that caused visitors like Charles Kingsley and others who came through here in that period to say that this was the prettiest town in the Caribbean, you know? And I suppose in a sense it was. Now, other things were happening as well. Port of Spain was very impacted upon by the nature of how the economies worked in Trinidad. Differing from other islands in the Caribbean, by the 1870s and 80s, Trinidad had developed two aspects of its agricultural economy. It had a burgeoning sugarcane economy that was mostly big business. It was the sugarcane industry owned by huge corporations like Tate and Lyle and that sort of stuff. And then the other economy was the cocoa economy. The cocoa economy was very interesting from the point of view that it was an everyman's economy. It was an economy that was owned by rich French Creoles who would own 500–600 acres of cocoa in Santa Cruz Valley or in Maracas St. Joseph, as the case might be, and also small farmers, small holders who will have 10 acres or 5 acres or 15 acres or 20 acres of cocoa. So it was an economy that touched the lives of many people. It made the rich richer, of course, but it also made the poor richer. It had a marvelous trickle-down effect. One of the impacts of the cocoa economy was that it created a burgeoning urban life that was very, very interesting. And a lot of the new neighborhoods that came into existence in the 1880s and 1890s come about because of the cocoa economy. All those pretty little gingerbread houses that you see, for example, in Belmont, in Woodbrook, Newtown, down Rushworth Street in San Fernando, all those places around there that you see them today, they look a little rundown, they look a little sad and unhappy and so. But how do they come into existence? They come into existence because of ordinary middle-class people who have a little 10 or 15 acres. Ask any Trinidadian. Say, all you used to have an estate. You say, yeah, my grandfather used to have 15 acres of cocoa in Tamana. Now, what that really meant was that once or twice a year, as the case might be, he was able to sell his cocoa and get $200 or $300. Now, $200 or $300 once a year or twice a year, depending on how he worked his business, was a very, very important thing for these colored people, you know, these ordinary Indian people who living in Port of Spain, these black people, ordinary people. What it meant was education for children. What it meant was improvement in lifestyle, to take them out of the grip of poverty and put them on the road where in the next generation the kids would do a little better. And that was the usefulness of cocoa as an economy in half of the 19th century and half of the 20th century. For 100 years, Trinidad's cocoa economy produced a true trickle-down economy. What it also did was this. All this cocoa had to go somewhere. Most of the cocoa was exported to Europe because the factories in Europe, like Nestle, for example, had discovered how to stabilize it and make the leap from cocoa to chocolate. And chocolates, bonbons, had become the great sought-after delicacy of the middle classes of Europe. And Trinidad cocoa, by happen chance or perhaps by hard work, as some would tell you, turned out to be the best cocoa literally in the world. As a result of that, they came into existence in Trinidad the very splendid organization called the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, where cocoa was studied and cultivated. And people came from all over the world to study Trinidad cocoa, because Trinidad cocoa was meant to be the real thing. Cocoa produced a whole mercantile class of people who exported cocoa. And exported cocoa, exported coffee, exported tonka beans, exported copra and coconut products, and imported galvanized nails, paint, corsets, sewing machines, etc., 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 etc. Right? So the cocoa economy produced a mercantile class that produced a business class. And out of this little commission agency business grew the great firms of Geddes Grant and Huggins and all those firms that grew into really big conglomerates, Neal and Massey. All of them have their roots, one way or the other, out of this kind of cocoa economy. From that now was how it impacted in architecture. You see it and it still exists. If you drive around Belmont, you drive around Woodbrook, you see the little old houses. Some of them are being modernized into really horrific things. But if you look carefully, you'll find some pretty old ones. You'll find some of them that have the same insides, that how they were built 100 years before. There's that. And then on the other hand, if you go into St. Clair, the old part of St. Clair, you will see the mansions. And if you go around the savannah, you will see the decaying mansions of what is now known as the Magnificent Seven. So that was the age of cocoa that impacted on the architecture of Port of Spain in a very, very real sense. The idea of fire is something that has haunted the Caribbean cities, particularly in the sense of in the 1880s and 1890s with Canboulay. Canboulay, as a part of carnival celebrations, was, for people who own property, a terrifying thing. For the people who had nothing to lose, it was fun and games. But the idea of 1,000 people or 2,000 people parading through the streets at night with burning torches and flambeaux, flinging them in the street, was a frightening aspect. Ironically enough, the Canboulay never burned down the town. But in the 1890s, Port of Spain burned down flat again, in much the same way as it burned down in 1903. It burned down, there was a great cricket match going on in the Oval, and most of the people had left Port of Spain to go to the Oval to watch cricket. And it surprised everybody to see this big column of smoke arising in the east. And it was a fire that had started in downtown Port of Spain, and it spread very, very rapidly through the city and burnt a lot of the town down. A lot of the old French buildings that had been built after 1803 were burned flat. Well, this was the opportunity for a young fella by the name of George Brown, a young Scotsman who had come out here. He was a bright guy who had a lot of good ideas with regard to architecture. And he was the man who was responsible for the rebuilding of Port of Spain, as you and I might have known it when we were young fellas. And that is the Port of Spain, the downtown Port of Spain of the big stores, of Stevens and Glendonings and Bonanza and Fogarty's. These were the stores with the wrought iron railings, huge windows, roofs that went up very, very high. In the interior, there was railings that went all around, making a mezzanine going through 2 floors, and on top of that was like a box with windows right around that could be opened like that. And this was the lantern roofs, because what George Brown had worked out was how to circulate air in a tropical environment. Hot air wanting to rise. He was able to open these lanterns, and this would literally, and they still have a few of them around, this would literally be a box like that, so on top of the roof of the building, where the hot air would be able to escape and cool air blow in. But most important, he would have been able to light the 2 floors by the natural lighting of the sun coming through. So he was able to light the buildings and air the buildings as a result of the lantern roofs. This was the epoch when electric trams were introduced. And people would tell you that somehow the trams and the stores sort of all matched, because the trams were made out of wrought iron with brass bars and brass railings, and so were the stores. So when the St. Anne's tram came down Frederick Street, clang, clang, and past the stores, and the trams was see-through, you could see the other side, the whole thing looked like something, you know, that sort of held together as a design. There are a few pretty things left in the city today. Like, for example, if you go to Woodford Square, you will see there is a very, very nice fountain. That fountain was put there by a man called Gregor Turnbull. Gregor Turnbull was a man who owned fleets of ships. And Gregor Turnbull was the man who brought, I would say, a large percentage of Indian people out of India to Trinidad on his ships. He made a lot of money in Trinidad. And when he got to be an old man, he decided that what he was going to do was leave something behind for the city to remember him by. And he created the fountain. He had shipped down from Scotland the fountain in Woodford Square. And if you look at it good, you will see that it is comprised of mermen, and it is topped by a marine Venus. Now, there was a time when on top of the Red House, there used to be a sea dragon. And this sea creature that formed part of the weather vane on the Red House, and the mermaids and mermen on the fountain, and the marine Venus, she's a lovely girl, and Marine Square all hung together, because this is the work of the town planner, that there was a marine beast on the Red House, there was a marine Venus in Woodford Square, and there was a marine square, and you know, there was a dragon's mouth. So that's old Port of Spain for you.
Great.
Tell you.
Briefly talk a bit about, you know,
What?
how you develop this love for what you do.
Oh,
Very
well,
briefly.
I was very fortunate, Anthony, in the sense that I really grew up with a lot of old people. I grew up in Hermitage Road in Belmont at a time when conversation was a very natural part of the conviviality of a home. And people used to talk. You see, they didn't have television, so people spoke to each other a lot. And I developed a liking for Port of Spain and in particular, and for Trinidad on the whole. And as a young fella, I used to ride around on my bike and literally ride up and down every street looking at everything in the whole of Trinidad, the whole of Port of Spain, right? I used to know every crack in the road. And later on, largely because of particular people that I met in life, people like, for example, Olga Mavrogodato, I was able to get in on the understanding of Trinidad's history. And then I met people like Michael Anthony, for example, who also shares a great love for this country and devoted a lot of time to writing and saving its various historical traditions and so. So over time, the memories of what my grandmother and my great aunts and so had to say, and what I went out to discover for myself, and what I learned as a result of meeting interesting people has all sort of come together in such a manner that I could sit down here this afternoon and tell you all of this. It's a pleasure.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. All Alrighty, that's a wrap. But you know, with you,